Kitty Genovese, the crime that changed how we see each other. In 1964, a woman screamed for help in New York City as the city slept around her, and while lights turned on and windows opened in nearby apartment buildings, history would later claim that no one called the police, shaping one of the most enduring and unsettling crime narratives of the 20th century. Yet the truth of what happened that night, what people heard, what they saw, and what they believed was happening, is far more complex and troubling than the simplified version the world came to accept. In the early hours of March 13, 1964, New York was quiet in a way it rarely ever is, with bars closed, streets nearly empty, and the hum of streetlights echoing through the residential blocks of Queens. Most people were asleep, unaware that within the next half hour a violent crime would occur that would ripple far beyond one neighborhood and permanently alter how society understood responsibility, empathy, and human behavior. This is not merely the story of a murder. It is the story of how a narrative was constructed, how repetition transformed assumption into fact, and how one woman's death became a symbol that often obscured the truth rather than revealed it. Her name was Kitty Genovese, and for decades the world believed it knew exactly how and why she died, even though the reality was far more complicated than the legend that followed. Catherine Susan Genovese was born in Brooklyn in 1935, the eldest of 5 children in a close-knit Italian-American family that valued hard work and resilience. Known to friends simply as Kitty, she was outgoing, confident, and fiercely independent at a time when independence in women was still viewed as unconventional. She worked as a bar manager in Queens, a demanding job that required long hours and constant vigilance, and she was respected for her ability to handle difficult situations without intimidation or fear. Kitty carried herself with assurance, dressed sharply, and was known for an easy, genuine laugh that made people feel at ease in her presence. She lived with her partner, Mary Ann Zilonko, in Kew Gardens, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood defined by modest apartment buildings, tree-lined streets, and a sense of everyday safety that residents rarely questioned. Kitty was not reckless, careless, or looking for trouble. She was simply a woman finishing a late shift and returning home, following the same routine she had followed countless times before. At approximately 3:15 a.m., Kitty parked her red Fiat near her apartment building and began the short walk toward the entrance, a distance that would normally take less than a minute. Before she could reach the door, a man later identified as Winston Moseley approached her and, without warning, stabbed her in the back. Kitty screamed in pain and terror, her voice cutting through the quiet streets as she cried out that she had been stabbed and needed help. Her screams were loud enough to wake neighbors, and in nearby buildings, lights turned on and windows opened as people tried to understand what was happening below. At least one man shouted for the attacker to leave her alone, and in that moment, Moseley fled the scene. For a brief and fragile moment, it appeared that the danger had passed. Severely wounded and bleeding heavily, Kitty struggled to her feet and began moving toward the entrance of her building, disoriented and in shock, but still alive. Many later assumed that this was the end of the attack, that help would arrive, and that the worst was over. It was not. Approximately 10 minutes later, Winston Moseley returned. He found Kitty collapsed in a doorway near the rear of the building, barely conscious and unable to call out for help. This time, there were no screams that echoed through the neighborhood and no voices shouting from above, as no one realized the attacker had come back. Moseley stabbed her again, sexually assaulted her, and then left her there, alone and dying. By the time police arrived, alerted by a neighbor who finally recognized the severity of what had happened, Kitty Genovese was dead. She was 28 years old. 2 weeks later, the crime took on a second life when the New York Times published an article that would become one of the most famous crime stories in American history. The headline was blunt and devastating, declaring that 37 people had witnessed Kitty's murder and failed to call the police. According to the article, dozens of neighbors watched from their windows, heard her cries for help, and chose to do nothing. The reaction was immediate and furious as readers across the country struggled to understand how so many people could allegedly ignore a woman begging for help. The story ignited widespread fear about urban life, raising questions about whether modern society had eroded basic human empathy, and whether people could still be trusted to look out for one another. The article spread rapidly and was soon cited in psychology textbooks, academic studies, and classrooms as a definitive example of what became known as the bystander effect, the theory that individuals are less likely to intervene during an emergency when others are present, believing someone else will take responsibility. Kitty Genovese was transformed from a person into a case study, her death reduced to a symbol of indifference and moral failure. Yet as time passed and the case was re-examined, journalists and researchers began to uncover a far more complicated reality. There were not 37 people who stood at their windows watching a murder unfold in its entirety. Some neighbors heard screams but could not see what was happening, while others saw a brief confrontation and assumed it was a domestic dispute. Some people did not realize a serious crime was occurring at all, and at least one neighbor shouted at the attacker. Another went to Kitty's aid, and another did contact the police, though not immediately. The attacks did not take place as one continuous event observed by dozens of witnesses, but occurred in fragments across different locations and moments, creating confusion rather than clarity. Compounding this confusion was the fact that in 1964, emergency response systems were slow, fragmented, and poorly understood by the public, as there was no centralized 911 system, and many people were unsure who to call or feared making the wrong call. The truth of that night was messy, ambiguous, and deeply human, while the headline was simple, dramatic, and easy to remember. The story endured because it resonated with broader anxieties of the time. As America's cities grew larger and more anonymous, crime rates increased, and neighbors became strangers. The idea that people could witness violence and remain passive felt believable because it aligned with growing fears about isolation and disconnection in modern life. Through repetition, the narrative hardened into accepted truth, and Kitty Genovese ceased to be remembered as a woman with a life and relationships, becoming instead a moral lesson. Winston Moseley was arrested 6 days later while committing another crime and confessed not only to Kitty's murder, but to multiple violent attacks across New York City. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and over the years his repeated escape attempts and parole applications repeatedly reopened wounds for Kitty's family, who watched helplessly as her name was continually invoked as shorthand for apathy rather than as a reminder of systemic failure. The bystander effect is real and has been documented in controlled studies, but using Kitty Genovese's death as its defining example came at a significant cost. It shifted attention away from institutional shortcomings such as delayed police response, inadequate emergency infrastructure, and unclear public guidance, while reinforcing the idea that people cannot be relied upon to help one another in moments of crisis. Kitty Genovese did not die because people did not care. She died because one man chose violence and because the systems designed to protect her failed to respond quickly and effectively. Ironically, the myth surrounding her death helped drive real change, contributing to the modernization of emergency response systems, the expansion of the 911 network, and increased public awareness about intervention and responsibility. In that sense, her story forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about what it means to witness suffering and how individuals and institutions should respond. Kitty Genovese was not a headline or a theory. She was a daughter, a partner, a hardworking woman with plans for the future, and her story deserves to be told accurately, not because accuracy is comforting, but because it restores her humanity. She was not abandoned by the world. She was failed by a moment, a system, and a story that grew larger than the truth. And perhaps the lasting question her story leaves us with is not what happened in 1964, but what we will choose to do the next time we hear a cry for help. Because history does not only record events, it measures our response to them.